It seems, from my perspective, looking at you and your life's work, that the through line of your life has been service to others.
I never wanted to be one of those people who somebody would say, oh, he lived in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth. I wanted to be seen as somebody who was an active participant in the times that I was living in. When I came down to Mississippi, I had somebody say, if you die down there, I'm not coming to your funeral. I've had to have something to fall back on, and that's kind of my North Star. And I was crying, and she says, you're pretty sad, aren't you? And I said, well, yeah. She says, well, we'll win next time. so it's like, okay, thank you. That's good advice.
What do you think the reason is for that growing sense of doom?
Knowledge work is not going to take that same level of preeminence. It's what kind of emotion, caring, love, joy are you going to bring to the situation and community is going to be the differentiator.
I'm Zoe Weil, and this is Solutionary Voices, where we bring together guests on the forefront of building a more humane, just, and healthy world for all people, animals, and the ecosystems that sustain life. Today I'm speaking with Hans Hageman, a man whose biography is hard to sum up in a short intro. He's a former prosecutor and public defender, the founder of several schools across the globe, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Reserve, a conservationist and permaculturist, a mentor to incarcerated youth, and a champion of civil rights and social justice. He directs Carencia Leadership to empower youth through leadership development, wellness, and sustainable food production. Welcome, Hans.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So we always begin Solutionary Voices by asking guests, what problem are you working to solve?
I'm working to solve the problem of people who have never gained or who have lost their sense of personal agency or life purpose. And that crosses a lot of different boundaries, whether it's a Princeton student or an incarcerated teen.
It seems, from my perspective, looking at you and your life's work, that the through line of your life has been service to others, and mostly youth, but not exclusively youth. So how would you describe the arc of your life that took you down all the various paths, and what's motivated and guided and inspired you to do all that you've done?
I never wanted to be one of those people who somebody would say, oh, he lived in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth. I wanted to be seen as somebody who was an active participant in the times that I was living in. And I got that early on from my parents. We were born in Chicago, but when I was about a year and a half, my mother took the three kids and were on a train to New York, where my father, a Methodist minister, had started with the East Harlem Protestant Parish, a residential drug treatment center called Exodus House. So moving from Chicago to Harlem, we stayed in on East 100th Street. There's a photographer named Bruce Davidson who did a collection of photographs on East 100th Street talking about the rich tapestry of life there and how populated and complex that was. And that was the block we lived in. My parents borrowed a cat and a dog to keep the rats off the young children, us, who were living in that tenement, until we were fortunate enough to move into public housing. And that was in Wilson Houses, apartment 11G. And in apartment 11G, we overlooked the FDR, the East River Drive, and got to see John Glenn and President Kennedy going down during a parade. I remember me, my brother and sister, as very young kids, linking arms and blocking the door to prevent our father from going out. And the reason we were doing that is because he was going to again, go march with Dr. Martin Luther King down south. And despite our young ages, we knew what that would entail or could entail, and were nervous. And he would just smile and laugh and say, well, I'm coming back, but if I don't, it's because I have to do something important for other people besides myself. And so at that early age, when that's the message, and then you have a mom holding everything down while he's gone, you learn early on that it's about more than you, or hopefully that's what you learn. And that was further instilled when we eventually moved into the residential drug treatment center itself, Exodus House. And so there I led kind of a schizophrenic existence, from going to collegiate school for boys, founded in 1628 with, the future masters of the universe, and then coming back at night to Exodus House, where we had our apartment and below us was dorms with 60 men. During the day, another 60 men and women would show up, but at night it was those 60 men, most of whom had been released from jail or prison, and many of whom were returning from the Vietnam War. And so conversations from the age of 10 on were about their life experiences, their challenges, waking up to 3 a.m. calls where somebody might have tried to take their own life, and my father having to go down and figure all that out, and trying to figure out, and realizing early on, though, and our parents made sure we knew this, that even though we didn't live like some of our classmates at collegiate, we were children with tremendous privilege just by being able to be on scholarship to those elite schools that we attended, and that we had a responsibility to something larger than ourselves. So it started early on.
And, it's interesting when somebody answers a question like that and goes directly to their parents. It's very moving that your parents instilled this in you at such a young age. And it feels to me like you're carrying on their legacy. Does it feel that way to you?
It does. And some of their unfinished work. From my mother, my father, in addition to being a Methodist minister, was a white man from rural Nebraska, a poor farming family. And my mother was an African-American woman whose 12-person family, I think it was how many, came up in the Great Migration from the South, and they met in Chicago. And for my mother in particular, I mean, she was a woman with tremendous creativity and genius, that for a Black woman growing up at that time, it was hard to express or find the palette to paint those skills on. My father, again, coming from poverty himself, but from a different place. And despite the tremendous disadvantages they took on, there were a couple things that came from that. One was they were anti-fragile, and that's a concept I like to work with now with the people that I work with. But also there were things that they weren't able to accomplish, in part because my mother developed Parkinson's at a young age, severe Parkinson's, and that happened as she was taking care of my father, who had a paralyzing stroke at the age of 51. And he was expected to die. My mother refused to hear that and got a private ambulance to take him out of Metropolitan Hospital and bring him to another hospital. And he survived and was aphasic and paralyzed on the right side. And that's a tough life for both of them, living on the fourth story walk-up of the residential drug treatment center. And there was so much more that they could have done and would have been able to do if their health had been maintained. And if they had gone about it if they had the resources that we now have with the internet and media and all that, they built something with very few resources and assets. So I feel like I have to carry that work on, and every time I'm slacking, which is rare, I think, I get brought back by the memory of, if my father could have been healthy at my age, how much more could he have done? If my mother hadn't had Parkinson's, what more she could have done?
I'm thinking about growing up in the 60s and 70s in New York City to biracial parents. Well, you're biracial too. Growing up with a white father and a Black mother at that time. That wasn't that common the way it is now. And there you are going back and forth between collegiate and Harlem. How did you juggle those worlds? And I'm seeing it in what you continue to do, that you live in every world. And, I'm going to want you to talk a little bit about the schools you founded, but you founded a school in Harlem. You also founded a school in India, that you've lived in so many worlds. And I'm wondering how your youth shaped your ability to live essentially anywhere and everywhere and serve anyone and everyone.
Well, my parents gave us a sense of possibility, and that anything, in fact, was possible, and that because of the education advantages we found ourselves living, that we had the tools to accomplish anything. And, I would also see my father talking with Duke Ellington, the jazz legend, at a concert for the drug treatment center, or the hand-me-down clothes we got from a guy named Warner Leroy, who created Tavern on the Green in Central Park, and on and on. But I also saw my father being investigated because at one point, supposedly, he was harboring Angela Davis. We would have known he wasn't, or being arrested when a group, a revolutionary group called the Young Lords, Puerto Rican-based equivalent to the Black Panthers, took over a church, and my father helped bring them food and keep them from getting arrested. And I also remember our mother. We hardly ever took vacations. All of a sudden taking us on vacation to stay with another collegiate family when we were very young. And it turns out my father had been ousted by his board in favor of a more patrician, more socially connected assistant executive director. And it was the first time I saw my mother cry. It was the first time I had seen her drink. But they handled it. My father, eventually the people in the program picketed and refused to go to treatment or counseling or whatever until my father was reinstated. So he got his job back, but that was seamless. I remember coming home from collegiate, I think it was freshman year of high school, and, walking through the projects and seeing smoke come up. It's like, oh man, it's another fire. I feel sorry for those people. But it was our house. Exodus House had burnt down, with my 1968 New York Jets Super Bowl program that my mother had received from Hall of Famer Buddy. I can't remember his last name, but he had played on the Colts, and she had gone to high school with him, and he got her that program and other things, including my purple velour leather lapelled jacket from Warner Leroy that I used to wear to school. I don't know why my parents allowed me to do that, but I did. But we lost basically everything, and that, and then trying to go to collegiate school and staying up with everything. But they found a 2-bedroom apartment. My mother and father slept on a pull-out sofa in the living room, and me, my brother and sister had the respective bedrooms. And it's like they never missed a beat. And so if they didn't miss a beat, how were we supposed to miss a beat? Perhaps triggering from some people listening to this early on. We didn't have a lot of things, but healthcare was another thing that was kind of lacking. But we were told about this wonderful doctor at Rockefeller University, and that he would provide free medical care. And so I got to see this doctor as a preteen. It turns out he was one of the most notorious pedophiles in the medical system. And it's something that, again, what do you do with that at the age of 11? But again, my parents were Stoics. They were anti-fragile, which according to the philosopher or economist Nassim Taleb means you bounce back stronger than ever. I mean, that was always the lesson. There was nothing that was ever supposed to stop us. And it wasn't just our parents telling us this. They were living it. I think back on how they maintained all that they did, the scrutiny from the government and police and, people's lives who were in shambles and them trying to put that back together and show that kind of grace. How was I, regardless of what happened to me, not going to at least live up to that minimum standard?
Did you talk to your parents about this doctor right away, or did you keep that to yourself?
They never found out because it would have hurt them deeply, and so for me that was something I needed to keep to myself, and I never talked about it until my family and I had moved up to wife and kids had moved up to the Hudson Valley. Ex-wife had moved up to the Hudson Valley, and I was watching television, and this doctor came on the TV, and they talked about his victims, hundreds of victims, some of whom had become drug addicted, developed mental illness, or had committed suicide. And then shortly thereafter, I was contacted by a lawyer, and she said, we've come across your name in our files, and if nothing else, could we interview you? Because you have seemed to function, and not just function, but prosper without any of the lingering effects that most of the clients we have taken on have had. And could we just talk to you about that? And I thought about that, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess that is what it is. But it also was the thing where early on, I made a commitment to myself. What do you take from this? And for me, what I took, there was always a lesson in whatever pain there was. And and I learned early from my parents that pain and adversity was always going to be with us. The lesson I took from it was that I was going to be, when I grew up, the one adult that any child would be able to trust. And that's kind of been, again, a through line in my work.
I think a little earlier on, you used the word sort of schizophrenic in terms of this lifestyle. And one thing that I found striking about your biography is that you were a prosecutor and a public defender. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody who was both. That this ability to sort of hold disparate things and see your role as being of service no matter where life has put you. I mean, even hearing this story about this pedophile doctor, and you've used the word anti-fragile a couple times, and you learned that from your parents. And I also wonder if that's almost in your DNA, that they gave you that modeling and they also gave you those genes, that something inside of you is prepared to do good wherever it's needed. I don't know. Does that resonate at all, or does that just...
It does, and I do think that it was imprinted early on, and it's something that I default back to when I have people who've criticized me. I had friends who stopped being my friend when I stopped practicing law to start my first school. It's like I had never existed. When I came down to Mississippi, I had somebody say, if you die down there, I'm not coming to your funeral. You don't belong down there. And so I've had to have something to fall back on. So yes, it's in my DNA. It's a deep imprint, and it allows me to fall back. And it's I guess Martha Beck or somebody would call it a North Star, and that's kind of my North Star.
I want to get to the various points along your journey, including how you came to be in the Mississippi Delta. Let's start with the school you founded in Harlan. Can you talk a little bit about, you had been a lawyer and you went to Columbia Law School and you're a prosecutor and a public defender, and then you start a school. Why?
Law was something, and it took a lot to make the switch in certain respects. Watching my parents go through what they went through, I said, you know what? I'm going to be a protector of people like that. And so law is going to be the best vehicle for that. So I always knew I was going to be a lawyer. Again, it was going back to wanting to be a part of my times. And so law and civil rights was deeply tied into the work that my parents had done. And so that was the path. And law school wasn't easy, but again, it was for me, unfortunately, in certain respects, it was kind of like checking a box. I needed to get through law school. I also had to work 20 hours a week because they couldn't pay for it, didn't have the money. My father had a stroke at the time I was going through law school. That wasn't easy. I had a friend who'd always come over during exams, and she would sit there and stay up all night to make sure I studied just before exams. So I'm eternally grateful to her for that. So law was something I was always going to do. And at first I started doing something called mortgage-backed securities. And I did that for a couple of years. And my mother said, is this the way you're going to save the world? And she could be harsh and direct at certain times. I remember a race at collegiate school during field day when I lost in the 100-yard dash in fourth grade. I think it was fourth grade or third grade. And I was crying, and she says, "You're pretty sad, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah." She says, "Well, we'll win next time." so I was like, "Okay, thank you. That's good advice." So I thought about what she had said, and I said, "Yeah, I can't do that." And I said, "Well, it was also at the time of the burgeoning crack epidemic, and I was living in East Harlem, so I saw what it was doing to my community." And so that's when I decided to join the legendary DA, Robert Morgenthal's office. And under him, former DEA agent, then later federal judge, but head of the Special Narcotics Bureau, the late Sterling Johnson Jr., as a DA. And I was there for 3 years. I'm glad I was there. But then I got a call from one of my Princeton roommates who said that he had been working as chief counsel to a Senate subcommittee on the Constitution, subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee in Washington, and he wanted to leave and make the big money lobbying. But his boss was not going to let him do that unless he found his replacement. And I said, well, I don't frankly know anybody. He goes, no, I'm thinking about you. And I said, I have no interest in being in Washington. He said, talk to the people there and see what they say. So I went to Sterling Johnson Jr., and he says, you have to do it. He says, this is part of the career path. You're going to be a lawyer. He says, you got to go. He says, you don't have to stay there forever, but you have to go. So I did that. I packed up, it was me, my wife, and a young man we had taken in to the house. We kind of unofficially adopted him. And again, I know I'm kind of wandering off on this path, but this is all part of who I am, and because he and I stay in touch. And so this was 1989, 1990. And Nick was somebody who I had known for a while. He and his younger brother I knew, and their mother, she didn't like me. She said, you're stuck up. You think you're better than everybody else. And I'm like, no, that's not. I don't think I give that vibe off. But she knew what she knew. But then she came up to me one time on the street and said, I know I've said some harsh things to you. She goes, but if anything ever happens to me, I want you to take care of my two youngest boys. And I thought that was strange. But then on 103rd Street, when I was living at the time in an abandoned building, it's a long story, but that's what I could afford. I heard gunshots. And as it turned out, the two young boys, that was their mother and older brother, and some other people in the apartment had been tortured and then murdered in a drug trade. And so this young man was on the street, and good size. I mean, he was well over 360 pounds as a teenager. And so it took up a lot of space or whatever. But the three of us got in a U-Haul and drove down to Washington with all my stuff. And he lied about his age because I couldn't get him in the schools in D.C. But he lied about his age and worked at a pizzeria. And I was there, and my wife at the time was working special events. And so I was there as chief counsel to the Senate subcommittee. I got to see law made. And like they say about law and sausage, you don't want to see either one made. But I got to, hang out with Joe Biden and Strom Thurmond and everybody in between, Ted Kennedy and so forth. And I wasn't sure how long I was going to be there. At the time, Congressman Schumer was thinking about bringing me on, but the decision got made for me because my parents' illness and inability to get around was becoming more challenging. And so I decided I needed to come back. And somebody said, there's this new public defender organization starting called the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, and they're looking for a chief counsel. And, and I said, well, I guess that's my opportunity. And so that's where I came back. And the people there, they did not trust me because, to your point about doing both, prosecutor and defender, the worst thing you could be coming into an office like that of true believers. And these people were true believers, incredible lawyers, but had no time for prosecutors.
So, Hans, what made you leave law and open your first school?
It was interesting, again, seeing how law was handled both from a prosecution side, but then also the defense side, and the compromises that you had to make and the things that you couldn't do for your clients. And a lot of the people that came across the desk or through the door were young people. And I said that there has to be, there's this story about this village, and people see these children drowning and floating by on the river. And so all the villagers run in and start pulling the children out before they drown. And one guy from the village walks away from the group, and where are you going? And he keeps walking. And then all of a sudden the children stop floating down the river, and he shows up again. And they said, where were you? He says, I made sure they didn't fall in the first place, right? And so I said I needed to get off what seemed to be at this point a treadmill and make more of an impact at the source, right? They talk about the school to prison pipeline. What does that mean in action? And the school made the most sense. And contemporaneous with that was the fact that my brother had decided that he was going to get his master's in education at Harvard, which he did, and was going to teach. And so he Had a few teaching jobs at our alma mater collegiate, then also at a Bronx high school. I had two things. One was to serve the children of the community, but the other was to keep my parents in the building that they had built. And the drug treatment center had shut down, and they were going to lose that property. And so I had two things that I needed to accomplish. For my brother, it was the school. And he says, well, I'm comfortable now, and I'm going to get a pension and all this other stuff. And I said, well, what will it take? I said, because I don't have the credentials, and I'd have to sell people on this. He said, well, if you can raise $50,000. I'm like, okay, it's an interesting number. And so there were two people I went to. One was a family friend who was a professional gambler, and he pledged $25,000. And then John F. Kennedy Jr., who was a few years behind me at collegiate, but who I also worked with at the district attorney's office, said that he would go to the newly formed Robin Hood Foundation to get the other $25,000. And they both kept their word. And so we started off with, and again, it was crazy to even think that we could pull this off, $50,000. And you had to get certain state approval for nutrition and reimbursements for meals. The fire department had to approve the building that had been a residential drug treatment center. There were no independent schools like that in the city. It predated charter school legislation. We had to find teachers who weren't worried about job security. And so that's what we did. And it's interesting. One of my teachers gave her first teaching job. She became a deputy chancellor under Bloomberg, is on Mayor Mamdani's transition team for education. That was her first job. And she wrote me and said, I'd never have been doing this if you hadn't taken a chance on me. Another guy is he came from the world of banking. And after his wife died, he wanted to shake up his life and do something different. So he came on as a teacher with us. He's now running a boarding school a day school in Vermont. So these are people who all took a chance on us. We had to figure it out as we were going along. I wanted our kids to not just get the standard curriculum that had not been serving them in the community. The building needed deferred maintenance, so I also became the maintenance man, fixing boilers, shoveling snow. I got there early so I could make breakfast for the kids, stayed there late because kids didn't want to leave until 7 o'clock when, for whatever reason, it would be safer for them to go home. And at the same time, it was the height of the crack epidemic, 2,400 homicides in New York at that time. And we happened to be in the middle of it, and we had apparently were seen as interfering with the drug trade on the block because we had a school now, and that was causing problems for the family that was running the crack business on the block. And so they took out contracts on my life and my brother's life. He was smart enough to leave early enough. I was the one leaving at night and getting there early in the morning. And they would stand across the street, these guys, opening their jackets, showing me their guns, laugh and say, your family's not going to see you. And went to the police. And the police said, well, we can do a couple things. We can give you 24-hour protection. I didn't feel comfortable with that. I didn't want police to be around the kids for 24 hours. I didn't want the drug dealers to think that they were at the top of our mind like that. The other thing the police told us we could do is they would expedite for me. My brother, he didn't want to get involved in those conversations, which I respect. But they said we can expedite a carry permit for you. He said, if you want to be responsible for your own protection. And in New York City, it's almost impossible to get a carry permit. I told the families, this is what I'm doing. The firearm will always be on me. If not, it'll be locked in a container in my office. And they said, we know how this is. We know how this goes. Thank you for protecting our children. And I had a body armor that I would wear out when I had to go home. And I had to do that for about a year or two. And then a couple of things happened. One is some of the police officers I'd worked with as a prosecutor remembered my work. I had also at the time boxed at a charity boxing benefit. I think his name was Michael McDonald. He was a police officer who had been shot by a 15-year-old he was pursuing in a robbery and paralyzed from the neck down. And this was, and he forgave the person who shot him, actually. And they were going to meet when this young man got out of prison, but he died within a month after getting out. He was shot himself. But McDonald was an incredible guy in terms of the level of forgiveness and so forth. So I was the only civilian in this boxing tournament benefit for this officer. And the cops didn't forget that. So what they did was they put word on the street that if anything happened to me or my brother, that there would be certain drug gang members found floating in the East River. And this was at a time where they meant it. The 80s, the early 90s, they didn't play. At the same time, I got a phone call from a mosque in Brooklyn, and they said, look, we know your father was white, but you were working with black children and children of color, and we are going to put the word out that we are going to soldier on the street if they don't take, the threat. You got these white undercover narcotics cops and black Muslims. At some point, you're going to make a business decision that it doesn't make sense. We'll have to figure out how to sell our crack some other way. So the family asked to have a meeting. And we had the meeting, and that was set up by a young man who was a police officer, former Marine, who grew up in the community. His father was a Vietnam veteran who raised 4 kids by himself, all great kids. And so this young man set up the meeting, and the head of the drug family said, what do you want? I said, we want the death threat taken off, and we want you to know that you can't sell crack in front of the building, right? I said, look, we don't have eyes on 24/7, so what we do when we're not in business, we can't enforce, but you can't do it between these hours. And this guy kept his word. And people would come out of jail and start selling for them. If they sold in front of the school, they would get a beating because they'd violated the terms of the agreement. So that was taken off. And then we had our 15 minutes of fame because I had been writing to different people to how am I going to raise money for this thing, to pay salaries and continue to do what we want to do and take these kids on trips to the boarding school so they can see them. And we got our 15 minutes of fame in part because JFK Jr. had been continued to push us and advocated for us to get a Robin Hood Heroes Award, which we did. He presented it to us at Tavern on the Green, and that opened the doors to a lot of money. And after that, it took off. And so now 30-something years later, my brother and I, we had to make a decision because after 9 years, one of us was going to kill the other one. We had different views on how kids should be educated and the level of empathy and compassion that you bring to it, and I won't get into that. But 2 friends who were very close to both of us, one is a former teacher, the other was a funder, said, you need to walk away. You can do anything. And you're very curious about life, so you need to be the one to walk away. And that was hard to hear because it had been my idea. But I did. I walked away. And contemporaneous with that was starting this girls' school in India, and then also taking over something called Boys and Girls Harbor, which had been started by Anthony Drexel Biddle Duke, a wonderful man, World War II veteran, started the program in 1937, I think, before he went off to World War II. So I landed in some good places, both at the girls' school in India, which I thought I was going to be, I was going to move to India, but Boys and Girls Harbor intervened, and I took over that 350 employee organization and ran that for 7 years.
When you say there's a quote on the website for Carencia Leadership, and I want you to talk about Carencia Leadership too, but there's a quote that says, we forge youth in the fire of strategic discomfort. And you've lived in that fire clearly your entire life.
Early on, and it's more than reinforced down here in the Mississippi Delta, the access to mental health resources are incredibly limited for a lot of underserved communities, regardless of color, but it has to do with economics. And you see what happens as a result of that absence. And so, whether it's CBT, DBT, ACT, internal family systems, or any kind of modality, they just aren't available, first of all. Second of all, in communities like the ones I've lived in, there's the inability to pay for it. There's a reluctance to, trust somebody who you don't know, who doesn't look like you, who hasn't lived your experience with your trauma. And so what do? And so I learned early on, I was not going to be the Olympic swimming coach of mental wellness. I was going to be a lifeguard. And so you do what a lifeguard has to do to keep people from drowning. Anti-fragility and creating that forge, what you're doing is you're letting people know that they have a bigger purpose than they've been led to believe. And once that happens, I've seen all kinds of transformation occur in kids who you would never think would be able to transform. I brought it to my work at Goshen Secure Center, which is a maximum security prison for teenage boys convicted of, and this is in the extremely violent crimes, so that they have to be tried in adult court. And I was asked to start a program there. And so what do you do, right? And they have some access to mental health resources, but with varying degrees of success. But what I brought to it was a mindfulness program, and a vegetable gardening program, And then in addition to that, not just a breathwork program, but a breathwork coaching program, which I never thought the state of New York was going to understand and get, right? Um, I thought they were going to be concerned about breathwork. That's shamanistic voodoo, whatever stuff, much less certifying these young men to be breathwork coaches. But my argument was, look, they have taken from their communities. They need to have a vehicle to give back. And what vehicles are they going to be provided with here? Regardless of whatever wonderful programs you have here, this is a way that's portable for them to go into whatever community they have and to give back, to teach people to harness their own internal resources. And at the same time, while they're learning how to do that, they're also paying attention to their own inward journey and their own inward vision. And they don't have to revisit their trauma. They can look forward to post-traumatic growth through the work of the breath or mindfulness. And the state, I don't want to say bought it, but I mean, I still am amazed because that was just a little bit pre-COVID and during COVID, because they couldn't get anybody in there during COVID except me to do programming. But now one of the reasons I'm going back to New York is to revitalize and bring this program back to this prison as a pilot program through Carencia, where it's going to be not just breathwork and mindfulness, but leadership. And so they're different forges. One is a spiritual forge, however one wants to define that. One is a leadership forge. Another is a brotherhood forge for these boys. And another is a wellness forge, so that you're not going to be able to bring anything to anybody if you haven't learned to take care of yourself. That it's not selfish, that's where that starts, that zest for life and possibility. That's where anything you're going to bring out to the wider world, it has to start with you first. And so, again, New York State, it took a while, but I met with several assistant, associate, I didn't even know there were different assistant and associate commissioners, and a deputy commissioner who I thought were going to tear me up. And again, revisiting this, say, not with kids who've committed murder and other violent crimes. But that's not what they said. They said, because of budgeting, we can't give you a letter of commitment, but we can give you a letter of interest. And so learning how to play those games has been interesting for me. They said, and if you can get, which I can, if you can get funding with our letter of interest, we'll do that. And then once you prove the pilot, we want to run this out to ideally every carceral institution in the state for young people. And then the New York State ombudswoman, who was not on screen, she says, well, I have a concern. And I'm like, oh, here we go. She says, this is about boys. She said, after the pilot, can you also bring this to the girls' facilities? And so I'm thinking to myself, you don't know who you're talking to, because I am going to say yes. But I had to remind them, there is only one of me, and I'm going to need to train people in this stuff. And I'm going to have to find people who are open to this, the modalities that I'm working with, which include breath work, emotional freedom technique, otherwise known as tapping, internal family systems, and some other things, trauma-informed mindfulness. But they're ready to go. I'm ready to go, and I'm anxious to get back to New York. I've had some people at schools in Louisiana and New York, not carceral facilities, but just schools, say we'd like to experience the program. Interestingly, I'm going to put my alma mater collegiate on blast. I reached out to the head of school there, and I don't know if you're familiar with the they had a little incident, I guess, a year or so ago, where some of the white students, and it's mainly white students anyway, dressed up as border security and ICE agents and refused to let black students and staff into the building unless they could prove citizenship or ID. Yeah, it was a joke. It was supposed to be a joke. And a lot of people got very, very upset, obviously. And I told the head of school, I said, look, this is the program I'm running, and people expect this just to be, their vision of the boogeyman, which is usually a person of color and poor and who's committed a violent crime. I said, but I hope you understand that these young men who you were responsible for need this leadership piece as much as anybody. And she was very polite, but I guess she also has to worry about her job. And we're still going to talk about that. I just find it interesting that they didn't jump on that to the same extent that this large bureaucratic organization in New York State did.
Right. And when, she queried about the girls, did she know that you had opened a school in India for girls?
I don't think so, no. And the girls' school was, I miss it. ran it for about 10 years, had a wonderful local head of school. But it was also interesting when I would go over, they said, look, you're going to have to go into these communities. And by communities, I mean people who had put together houses from plywood and cardboard and so forth. You're going to have to convince them that we're not educating their sons, we're educating their daughters. And so I did that. And it was very interesting in a lot of ways. But we had to shut it down because Hindu and Muslim fundamentalists threatened my head of school. And so for her safety, we had to shut it down. Interestingly, my wife at the time and I also received death threats in New York from people who said, you need to support the Black community and stop going to places like India. And we're watching you. And if you don't redirect your resources, and this was money out of my pocket. This was my life's savings. Then again, we had another death threat that was investigated by the 23rd precinct. And so it's like, what is it? Is this how I'm supposed to be living? And, you try to do the right thing and then that's what you get.
Okay. I'm wondering how you ended up getting trained in all these other modalities, mindfulness and breath work and permaculture, which is not a modality, but, doing sustainable farming, like all of these other things. Did you pursue them in part because you're dealing with death threats all the time? Like you needed it for yourself?
I realized that I was saving myself, but I was also going to be able to feed two birds with one stone by bringing these tools to the young people. And again, families, the level of trust was incredible on the part of the families. But again, I am eternally curious. And so whether it's neurolinguistic programming or tapping as it was then known, now it's known as emotional freedom technique, hypnosis, any tool that I could bring was something that I used. And I'm glad I did because it saved both me and the young people that I've worked with.
Well, Hans, I have never faced the kinds of things that you faced. And my own journey, took me to learn some of these modalities too, and also to bring them to youth. And I want to talk a little bit about what you have noticed the shifts have been among young people over the many decades that you have worked with youth and you've been in the field of education. And I'll tell you what I've noticed, and we can see if these things compare. So I have noticed a growing sense of doom, a belief that a better world is not possible, not likely. And this is across the board. This is at schools like Nightingale that I went to, a private girls' school. And I just asked a group of high school students at a public high school in a working class, very small city in Maine, do you think that the world is going to become more just and sustainable and humane in your lifetime? And not a single student raised their hand. And I'm watching this getting worse. I mean, in 2012, I was speaking at a school in Connecticut. I asked the kids what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. We filled up a whiteboard with the problems they listed. I asked them to raise their hands if they thought we could solve them. And of the 45 kids, only 5 raised their hands.
Wow.
And that was in 2012. So it's only gotten worse from my experience. And I'm wondering if that's true in your experience. And if so, what do you think the reason is for that growing sense of doom?
Yeah, so down here, the kids, their vision and sense of the future is incredibly limited. I actually had a Princeton student come down here to talk to them who happened to be from the Philippines. And this was a young man, freshman year. I tried to get other Princeton students to come down here to intern. They said they were too scared. I was told that confidentially. But this young man from the Philippines came. This was his only other stop in the United States besides Princeton University. And he had come from a family where he caused a bit of a stir criticizing the local politicians on social media so that his family's home and business were burnt. And a month later, he had to travel to Princeton. So this is who he's now president of the student government. But he came down here and you could kind of see what he was made of. But except for young people like that, whether it's, but he tried to talk to the kids and was telling them about the possibilities out there. And they just looked at him like it was a foreign language and not Tagalog. It was like, what are you talking about? What kind of careers? We've never heard of anybody doing that. So there's a baseline here that's not going to change anytime soon. And I don't want to get started on the stuff I've seen down here in terms of how people's ambition is strangled in infancy, and sense of purpose. But even with Princeton students I've worked with, I mean, they're very concerned. I had a group of 6 that I took on as remote interns, which was interesting. I mean, brilliant young people, but they were all, interestingly, scared of AI. And we had to have long conversations about that if they, in their positions of privilege and eventually power, didn't embrace how do you ethically use AI, then it was going to default to politicians and people who make all the money to make those decisions. And so they eventually embraced it and have done some interesting things with the work. But their level of concern about the future and what impact it's going to be possible for them to make it's been troubling, and it has created a certain level of urgency, both from young people who have seemingly everything, but then also, as has always been my mission, for young people who have nothing, because that's only going to get worse. They don't realize that those trucking jobs are going to disappear. When retail establishments are going to be serviced through technology, what are you going to do? I think there are ways through it that ideally the work of the heart and the hands becomes as valued as the work of the mind. And that is actually one, in my opinion, thing that AI will inadvertently do. It's knowledge work is not going to take that same level of preeminence. It's what kind of emotion, caring, love, joy are you going to bring to the situation and community is going to be the differentiator.
And it is really interesting that this sense of despair or hopelessness about the future, it crosses race, it crosses ethnicity, it crosses religion, it crosses class. Interestingly, there was one place where I asked students if they thought that we could solve the problems that we face, and it was at an international school in Mexico. It was actually a similar demographic to the Connecticut school, where the kids didn't think that we could solve our problems. And the reason that and they were 5th graders, so they were young, but so were the Connecticut students. They were both 5th graders. But the reason why they thought problems could be solved is because their teacher had been integrating real-world environmental issues into their learning, and they were solving problems in their school, in their community. So they had this sense that problems could be solved because that's what they were learning how to do, and they were solutionaries. I think part of what I'm hearing from you with helping kids become anti-fragile leaders and helping them with the inner work is giving them this sense of agency and purpose and love and community that are the ground from which anything else is possible.
Absolutely. And as part of that, they have to be taught that they can't default to technology to find those answers, that they have to be in community with one another to feed that kind of thing. And, that's the other thing, because as you know, right, children can get lost down the technology rabbit hole. I'm engrossed in it myself, but again, that's after several decades of all the other stuff. And so how do you bring all those things together and let people know what the sense of possibility and agency is? It's why my work in prison with these kids is so urgent, because they just, by definition, that sense of personal agency is gone. And how do you prepare them to even think that it's possible to regain it?
So I'd love it if there are any stories from your long journeys with kids and adults, any stories that sort of stick out for you that you would want to share really any stories that you want to share, but I'm specifically thinking of transformation from loving anti-fragile education, what you've seen it do.
There are a range of things. I mean, there's a sister I remember, the 2 sisters who came to our school. Their mother didn't speak English. Their English wasn't that great. And this was my high school, the independent high school that I started. And she says, I don't know what to do. but I need to do something else because they're going to place them in special ed. And it was clear that it was only because of the language issue. These girls were with us, and now, one sister is married with her 3 kids and has her own business. And the other sister is, she's got her PhD in psychology, and her dissertation is done. And, I've asked her to serve on different committees with me for farmer mental health, which, again, it's weird. This 14-year-old all those years ago is now somebody I have to rely on as an expert. Another student who, she was just out of control. Her father was a Bloods gang member. One of the things that I made sure I took my kids on in high school, we did a lot of adventure stuff in the middle school, but in high school, I wanted them to travel internationally. And thinking about it now, it's crazy that we went to places like Ghana and Nicaragua, Kenya and so forth. I mean, it's like, with one chaperone, right, who wasn't much older than these kids, one other chaperone. But, this one young lady on graduation, she and another young lady from this high school decided that they were going to go stay in a Uyghur community in China for a month, which, 2 18-year-old black girls, it's like, this is crazy. But they did that, and this one young woman then ended up going to the Air Force and then became a contractor for a company in Alaska. And then she said she went through some tough periods, but said, where am I going to make my next mark? And I then 2 months ago got a call, and she says, I'm not that close, but I'm a lot closer than you think. And it turns out she's now working in Jackson, Mississippi, helping a community organization that works with teachers. And she said, I can do big things in Mississippi. Mississippi needs me. She goes, I know you're leaving. She says, but I'm going to stay and pick up where you left off. And so, to hear that is incredible. I had mentioned the young man who would live with me and my first wife back in D.C. He left us when his father got out of prison, and he lived with his father until his father, while the young man was in the next room, took a shotgun and killed himself. And so this young man has had a lot of tragedy and turmoil, but he's a successful, self-employed businessman now in Pennsylvania, right? And so at every level, or some of the students I work with during COVID at Princeton, who again were wondering what is my world now going to look like, because they couldn't see past COVID, but who are now, one is very successful at a public relations agency. I mean, so there are a number of things that kind of run through my life that there's a young man who I saw his text come up as we were talking, who I met in 1976, who got back in touch with me almost 50 years later. And I met him at a notorious reformatory called Skillman Reformatory. It's now closed because of how bad it was. But he said that as he moved through his life, it was a teacher and me that he always kept in mind, because I volunteered at Skillman as a Big Brother in the Big Brother program. Whenever he thought he was going off the rails, he would always think about the talks that we had. And both those talks and another teacher who was his mentor, he took with him, and he, he had a couple of stumbles along the way. But he ended up going into the Navy, and now he has, it's not a fancy job, but he's an assistant manager at some kind of retail store. And he stays in touch. And I wasn't much older than him at that time, but so those are some of them.
Wow. It's pretty amazing to think about all of the people whose lives you changed for the better over all of these years.
Now, this has been you've made it a very easy conversation, and I appreciate you for allowing me to do my life review. I have a smile on my face because, as I struggle to figure out how I'm going to make the move from here back to New York and jumpstart Carencia leadership and this pilot program, you've allowed me to look back and think about, again, reminding myself that, in fact, I am anti-fragile, and this is just a challenge that I need to step up to. So thank you.
Okay. So you're 67 years old. You're moving again, embarking on a new leadership role for yourself. And, I feel like if we came back to have a conversation in 30 years, I can imagine you being 97 and still, heading somewhere to do something, to be of service. And it's pretty powerful just to hear your story and the arc of it. And I'm really excited for your next phase. And the way I like to end these conversations is with this final question, which is, what would you like your epitaph to be?
He was an ancestor worth remembering.
That is a perfect and beautiful way to end this conversation. And I thank you so much for your time. I thank you for all that you have done, are about to do, will do in the future, because it matters so much. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you for giving me the space and showing the kind of care and attention that it's tough to come by nowadays. Thank you.
You've been listening to Solutionary Voices, and if you like what you've heard, I hope you'll subscribe, write a review, share this episode and others with people who can benefit from them. And if you are thinking, how can I be a solutionary too? I invite you to read my book, The Solutionary Way, and head on that journey yourself. Thank you so much.